Welcome to View from the North on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today we'll talk again about Canada. Canada under Mark Carney. How can he face down Trump? Our guest for the show is Ken Rogers, retired Canadian businessman. Welcome to the show, Ken.
Hello, Jay. At least we're still personal friends, but I can't say that between our nations.
No, I feel more friendly to Canada than the US these days. Canada, our most important neighbor, our most important trading partner. And we need to keep track of the disruptions, the increasing, continuing disruptions Trump is causing to that relationship. So I'd like to discuss with you the events that have taken place since the last time we spoke. Mostly, I guess that's about Mark Carney, and he's on his way, or soon will be on his way to meet Trump. What's going on with Mark Carney? Is he strong?
He's very strong, very brilliant. He was a scholar at Harvard University in Boston, and then he also went to Oxford University in England. He was the governor of the, let's say he was an executive with Goldman Sachs in New York City for a long time, many years, moved up through the ranks and got transferred around to a variety of posts. So very diversified background in, mergers, acquisitions, and finance generally. Before he became the governor of the Bank of Canada. And then, to a surprise to many in the world, he became the governor of the Bank of England. Now, his Oxford education would have helped that, and he was a phenomenally high-level scholar. But he's a very different personality than Trump. He's, quiet, polished, reserved in his comments. He certainly isn't going to, insult Trump like, let's say the premier of the province of Ontario, very Trumpish in nature. He immediately, caused some kerfuffles with Trump. Carney isn't, he's not looking for a fight. He'll be extremely rational, but he's, let's say very well prepared would be a way to describe it. That is, it's very clear that his belief is that the United States has changed fairly permanently. That is, many in the U.S. treated as, Trump's just doing a whole bunch of this stuff to get everybody to agree to some quick negotiation where the U.S. would have the upper hand. Carney doesn't look at it that way, and in the recent Canadian election made it very clear that Canada had to change directions and major economic disruption in doing so. One of the key things in my mind is Trump has dealt with the imports that the U.S. has from Canada as if they changes in that flow of trade, could have a quick and instant effect. Well, he's done, if I pick half a dozen of the categories that really count, one of the biggest ones is everything to do with automobiles. He has autos and auto parts, and steel and aluminum. And currently, the tariff levels, like steel and aluminum at 25%. Now, if those were to exist for a long period of time, nobody would really want to sell their aluminum and steel to the U.S., at that price, or basically, I should have said that the other way around. People in the U.S. would not be too happy buying steel and aluminum at a 25% higher price than yesterday. But it would take several years for the U.S. to replace the imports that they get. And in the case of aluminum in particular, that would be very difficult. At this time, the U.S. is suffering from the inability to produce enough electricity power to handle all the data centers that are needed and coming on stream. Well, aluminum, uh, basically the refining of bauxite into aluminum requires an awful lot of electrical power, or power, not necessarily electric, but and and let's call it about 10 Hoover dams, so that you really can't just overnight stop aluminum from coming into the U.S., but the effect would be to have a 25% increase in the price. But those that currently supply that would say, well, this can't last forever. They either, find different markets or change their production. You Now, similarly, the United States use their biggest import from Canada is oil. Well, that's just going to keep flowing. You have other key imports that the U.S. can't do without is potash, which is the biggest export from one of our provinces, Saskatchewan. And all of the farmers in the U.S., this year might be not too unhappy that they don't get a bunch of potash, because when the U.S. stopped all of its international food aid to Africa in particular, then, all of the products that are produced in places like Iowa, where do they go? If the U.S. doesn't buy them to give away to the world, then the U.S. has, a phenomenal overproduction problem. And if you have too much corn on the market, the price of corn goes down and the farmers start to choke. None of these things are sustainable for any length of time. Now, I tend to think that an awful lot of the U.S. and especially Wall Street seems to have believed in the past, and still to a great extent, that all of these, ridiculous tariffs will pass pretty quickly. I don't really think that that's Trump's game plan. He really wants a significant number of the tariffs to stay on the world in total in order to provide the U.S. government the tax revenue, or revenue that is needed in order to keep the U.S. deficit from being too large, given the tax cuts for the very rich in the United States. I think, that to me is the key motive behind Trump's tariffs. I think it's a secondary motive that he wants to enjoy the idea that in his own mind, as opposed to reality, that he's a wonderful negotiator. Well, if you take, a much smaller country like Canada, Canada population is about the same as the state of California. Surely, Trump understands he can beat up Canada and the economically, and the tariffs are doing a pretty damaging job, especially to what is considered the heartland in Canada, the southern Ontario and southern Quebec. where things like automobiles are produced and or parts and aluminum is smelted and steel is fabricated, steel is processed. Now jobs are hurting in Canada already. There'll be a time delay for them to hurt in the U.S. But the important thing is, what is the brand new government going to do? Well, one of the first things they got a problem with is that, Trump greatly changed what the election result would be. Exactly the same as subsequently has in the last couple of days happened in Australia. Is there was in both Canada and Australia, if you went back 3 or 4 months ago, just before Trump got elected, that it was pretty sure that a small c conservative type government would replace a small l liberal type government in both Canada and Australia. Well, once Trump got in, that was just a phenomenal change in both countries. Now, in Canada, our elections results are very similar to the US. If you took a map of the US and you colored it, one color for the Democrats and one color for the Liberals, or for the Republicans, you'd find that it looks very much like an election map in Canada. There are huge areas that every year vote the same way, no matter what the election is. You're going to have, from the Rocky Mountains to the Mississippi River and from the Canada border to Mexico, it's all going to be Republican. You'll have everybody looks surprised when Denver, Colorado will vote for a Democrat. But they're pretty rare. You find, maybe you get a phenomenal candidate like representing Minnesota will vote for a Democrat, but generally it's going to be the same. Or in the deep southeast area from Nebraska to Virginia, going south to Florida, virtually, everybody would be astonished if it wasn't just almost solidly Republican. Well, you go to, Los Angeles, New York City, Boston, like Massachusetts and Connecticut. Nobody would ever dream that Massachusetts and Connecticut would vote for very many Republicans, if any. Well, in Canada, it's exactly the same. Well, one of the problems that our Prime Minister now has, which has a US connection with it, is our election results have usually been very much the same. We have generally had, 3 or 4 little wee splinter parties. One of them in the province of Quebec, always gets, some votes, a meaningful number in the province, that they want Quebec to separate from Canada. And they looked like they were progressing along pretty well till Trump came in, and then suddenly all kinds of people didn't vote for that party. They lost about half the seats they normally would have in the federal government, which was really about a third of the seats from that very large Canadian province. And they went to one or the other of the two parties. Really it was pro-Trump or, pro-separation, almost were the two choices. Similarly, across the country, you had the same results as normal, except the splinter parties got beat up, especially outside of Quebec. For example, Ontario, the province of Ontario is by far the most populous province in Canada. And it has about a third of the population of all of Canada. And normally its votes are, let's say they give maybe a quarter of the votes in that province go to splinter parties. Well, this time there wasn't a single splinter party that got a seat. The Trump effect, even though the general drift of who votes conservative and who votes liberal was essentially the same, but it had an extra special effect in Canada is two of the provinces in Western Canada that are most important in U.S. trade, Alberta and Saskatchewan. Alberta has most of all the oil. Saskatchewan has pretty well the rest of it. Saskatchewan has all the potash that the U.S. farmers need. They have most of the uranium that runs a good slug of the U.S. atomic plants, and those provinces, have always voted. Let's say for the last dozen years, the government in Ottawa has always been the other party. That is, they've always been the Liberal Party, Justin Trudeau, and those provinces absolutely hated him. They hated his father. They hated that party. They have always voted conservative. I was born there. I was born a conservative. This is the first Canadian election I ever voted for anybody else. It was just ingrained into my soul that that's who you vote for. Well, what you've done, what the Trump effect and this election has done and created a problem for Carney is those two Western provinces, they're much larger than U.S. states physically. They run from the Rocky Mountains to the Great Lakes. Those two cover most all of that. The problem that was created partly with this election was before Trump came in, it was pretty clear that the Conservatives would have an absolute majority in Canada. And those two provinces had felt that they have been totally screwed by the federal government under Trudeau. I, as an economist, tend to agree. And I'll use an example that is no longer in effect, but happened. Okay, there was a pipeline that was going to get built from Alberta to Vancouver. That's about the same as going from Denver to San Francisco. And it's shorter in Canada because the Rocky Mountains run at an angle rather than straight north-south. However, the pipe that was produced in southern Ontario, the contractor, just to show how stupid it was, had the pipe sent all the way to Vancouver and then back to Calgary to start building the pipeline. Well, this made national press this sounds pretty stupid. Why didn't you let it off in Calgary in the first place? And the answer was, well, there was a freight rate agreement that said we can ship anything that's manufactured from Ontario and Quebec to the hinterland. I use that term cynically, for less money than to ship the same product the other way. Hence, you could never develop manufacturing in Saskatchewan, Alberta, or British Columbia. It always had to be in Quebec or Ontario. You couldn't produce it in the maritime provinces north of Maine, like Halifax and Nova Scotia. You always had the hinterland produce the raw materials to make Quebec and Ontario richer. Well, Justin Trudeau had a bunch of policies that were about that ridiculous, that favored Ontario and Quebec and blatantly discriminated against and hurt Alberta, Saskatchewan, and to a lesser extent, British Columbia. British Columbia could usually get away because they had oceanfront and very close connections with, Seattle, Portland, California type of area, and so they didn't get beat up as much by Ottawa or the Canadian government as it did the Prairie provinces. Well, Mark Carney has inherited this problem, and as this election went on, and it was very clear that there was not going to be a conservative majority in Ottawa, and therefore some of these stupid Trudeau policies would end. Those provinces started to speak out and saying, well, some residents of those are saying, well, maybe being, a 51st state in the U.S. for Saskatchewan and Alberta wouldn't be too bad anyhow. Now, the majority in those provinces don't agree with that, but a few loudmouth people, including the Premier of Alberta, has really just made a lot of noise and rattled the cages and said, well, we wouldn't mind, we won't object if there's a referendum to talk about separation and things like that. Well, hence, Mark Carney, as part of his election platform, very wisely, certain of these Trudeau policies, just as an election platform, said, we're canceling these. They're done. We're not, that's over and done with. Now, there's a couple of them, important ones left. Now, an outside observer might see a contradiction, Canada has always had far more environmental restrictions than the United States, very more environmentally conscious than the U.S. I don't think the U.S. public is less in favor of good environmental things, but certainly the federal and state legislation in the U.S. is a danger to the public good. That Canada doesn't have any Flint, Michigan type problems. Assuming your audience knows what I mean by that.
I'm sure they do.
So Carney has as a equally or more important task than dealing with Trump is making sure that he's got Canadian unity, like a unification question. So one of his major platforms is we will have pipelines as a major priority in Canada to get Canadian oil and gas to the oceans, where we now ship virtually all our oil and gas to the United States. One of the biggest, I would say by far the largest benefit the United States has in its trade with anybody and everybody in the world, in fact, almost with all of them combined, is the fact that Canada ships oil to the United States at a discounted price. The US then refines it and bumps it up so that the United States makes more money on Canadian oil than Canada does. Now, the whole deficit with the United States really relates to the export from Canada to the US of this wonderfully favorable to the Yankees or to the Americans of the oil and gas. Carney has to figure out how, let's say, the province of Quebec in Canada always is a thorn to everybody in the western part of Canada and also to the maritime provinces in Canada. And one of the reasons that they alienate the West is they will object to a pipeline, and in the past we've had suggestions of pipelines going, from Alberta to right to the Atlantic Ocean, to a huge refinery and just above Maine, in the southern part of the province of New Brunswick. And the Quebecers objected to this, but what did they do instead? You see, they buy oil for refineries in Montreal in particular, and they buy it from places like Libya or Angola that have the world's worst environmental record there is. And they just don't care. It almost, to a person from Alberta, they would say they would rather buy from Putin than they would buy from Alberta. Like that, they tend to think that, they sincerely believe it. I was born and raised with that bias around me, and I have yet to shake it, because when you see somebody like Trudeau saying, "Oh well, Quebec can do whatever they feel like. We won't use any federal government arm twisting or anything else to persuade them to anything else." Just kiss their behind. And so Carney, he's promised a bunch of pipelines. Because of the threat from the United States, which scares Quebec more than anybody else in Canada, they've acquiesced a little bit. That's last week. That they would vote like the way Canada voted. Quebec voted virtually all the seats in Quebec that didn't go to the separatist party went to the party that Carney runs. The Conservative Party, the Republican equivalent in Canada, got virtually no seats in Quebec, where Quebec really is about 1/5 of Canada, population-wise, and seat-wise. The effect of the election in Canada, which Trump pushed, has put special efforts on Carney to create things that solidify Canadian unity, even though there's no problem with Canadian unity of hatred to Trump. That's key to why he's even in power. It was really, East versus West. It was really the Trudeau type Eastern run government versus the hinterlands, the previously discriminated against parts of Canada. So anyhow, Carney has a tough task in dealing with Trump. There would be no better person in the world you could find to do it. And I don't think he's going to bow, because Canada is going to hurt. The U.S. can't really do without the stuff from Canada. And so that I think that common sense would say that Carney has been preparing Canadians that this is going to take quite a bit of time. That is, the automobile industry in Canada, in southern Ontario, near Toronto type of thing, is going to hurt a lot more than the pain in the U.S. Now, the pain in Michigan isn't going to be much different than the pain in Ontario, but Trump is basically going to have to bend before Carney. He's going to have to accept that the damage to the U.S. economy is something he can't tolerate and change the policies, much like he did when he started off with a 25% tariff on potash and a 25% tariff on oil imports into the US. Well, he backed off on those because of pretty instant pressure. He seems more dug in to ruin auto, steel, and aluminum, but there's not a heck of a lot Canada can do about it. You can't say, "Oh, please, Mr. Trump, we're hurting, we're hurting." He'd say, because the answer would be, "Oh, goody, goody. That's what I want to do. I want all those companies to set up a factory in the U.S. next week." It just won't happen.
I'm not as optimistic as you are, Ken, about Mark Carney. Yes, he's a gentleman and a scholar, and he's really been around in terms of fiscal policy and politics, for that matter. But at the end of the day, he's dealing with a guy who is determined to show him up, determined to make him look bad, determined to make Canada look bad, and who does not have guardrails, who does not have limits, who will say things that are absolutely outrageous, and he'll catch some Canadians on that. I think, you have described a situation perhaps which is a little more disruptive than things were before Trump came back on the scene. Yeah. And I think a lot of people in Canada are concerned, and Canada's business and future prospects are disrupted. And that's only the beginning, because, Trump keeps going on this. Even as recent as today, Trump said that he wanted Canada to be the 51st state, that he could give it a great economy, which isn't true, and that everybody would be happy. Now, that's just, none of it is true. But he's no stranger to making lies to people, and then, changing his mind and turning his back on whatever he suggested or proposed or promised. Carney is a gentleman. He's not going to play that game. And the question is whether the two of them in a room, and I guess they're in a room, or they will be in a room very soon, within the next couple of days, if not already. And Trump has stuff up his sleeves. The press asked him, what he planned for this meeting. And he said, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. Of course he knows. And I don't know if Carney knows what's going to happen. I'm not sure that he knows how Trump operates. It could be a string of insults. It could be that Trump tries to reach around Carney to the electorate, to the political forces in Canada, try to embarrass Carney, try to make him look bad, call him names, insults, And what he did with Trudeau, he had no reason to do that with Trudeau, but he thought he would disrupt Trudeau's political balance, however unbalanced it might have been, make him look bad, and change the way people in Canada thought about this. He's not finished. The good news is that Trump said that he would not use force in taking over Canada, but he wasn't so sure that he was not use force in taking over Greenland. He has intentions to take both places over. He says, he needs Canada and Canada needs the US, neither of which statement is true. And he needs Greenland for reasons that escape me. He says it's a matter of national security. But all this is a kind of crock. Meanwhile, he's destroying with a wrecking ball vengeance, the United States. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about, why in the world Trump persists in demanding that Canada become the 51st state, and why in the world, we think that a gentleman like Mark Carney is going to be able to deal with a street person like Trump, who has all these tricks up his sleeve, including, his social media efforts. He probably has organizations within Canada that will be dedicated to criticizing Carney. This meeting that's about to take place is not going to be that easy. And I wonder if you could give us a more of a down on the ground kind of set of recommendations to Carney. How should Carney conduct himself? Because right now it's a mystery about how this meeting is going to go, what it's going to cover, what the parameters are, and what Canada, what the victimhood that Canada will suffer. And by the way, I do need to ask you about Carney's proposed countermeasures, because I really haven't seen them or heard much about them lately. It's all about how Carney will handle things. But what can he do? How can he stop Trump?
I would believe his strategy, to a great extent, is to recognize that he can't do anything, and to get on bended knee and beg and plead would be the worst thing to do. So really, he has stated to Canada that there will be no quick solution to this, where Trump needs a quick solution. Trump believes there would be a quick solution. I don't think he understands the complexity of trade, particularly how long it took to negotiate the NAFTA agreement in the first place, let alone, he wants to now revise it dramatically or whatever he wants to do with it. But, really, I think that Carney will visit Washington simply to listen rather than make proposals but for sure, I would be absolutely startled if he does anything that would look like begging or kissing the ring.
No, but you know what, Ken? I mean, you don't have to beg or kiss the ring to have Trump turn around to the media and manipulate the message and make it look like you begged and kissed the ring. And then Carney, he's one down on the negotiations, and he's one down in terms of Canadian public opinion. That's what I worry about. I think he's got to take strong positions. He's got to deal with Europe and China. He's got to try to organize other trading arrangements. There was some discussion of how Canada might join the EU. I personally like to see that. I'd like to see the border hardened by Canada. I know I saw recently that a lot of Canadian airlines are not flying to the US anymore, ostensibly on the basis that the routes are more profitable when they fly to Asia or Europe. And whether that's true or not, that is a great statement. While Trump is still detaining Canadian citizens for ridiculous reasons, whether they try to come or go across the northern border, I find that extraordinary, and I think that Canada ought to do the same kind of thing. You want to mess with me, I'll mess with you, and that's the only way. And of course, Trump doesn't take responsibility for detaining these people, but his organization does. His Homeland Security people, they do that, and I think this is a game of playing to the press, of playing to public opinion. And Mark Carney has to be prepared for all kinds of tricks and deceptions that Trump will try. It won't be a quiet meeting in a quiet room, which doesn't get out. It'll be all kinds of public statements that are deceptive, that are untrue, and that are intended to make Carney look bad. I hope he realizes that.
I think he does. Very much, and I'm not as pessimistic as you about it. I think that Carney and Trump in the same room, that's like having me against Muhammad Ali. I'd have no chance. Carney is brilliant, capable, with great, phenomenal control of any emotion that, just kind of the opposite of Trump. But um, there's, you know, like with the position that Trump has taken and why he has taken it, there's no great reason or need for Canada to react, just to immediately bow down.
Well, I know that's true. And that's a very important calling card. And, if Carney suggests, for example, to Canadian businesses that they should boycott US goods, US imports, if he suggests to the Canadian public, and they may do this whether he suggests it or not, that they should boycott American products, then certainly that'll give him an advantage. Whether he stands up and makes that statement in public or whether it just simply happens around him and around Canada, I think that there has to be a kind of pushback on this. I mean, for example, just yesterday, Trump said he was going to impose a 100% tariff on movies that are made outside the United States. It's a little vague about what he's actually going to do. But what he's, that also affects Canada. There are a lot of movies that can and should be made and produced, and for that matter, edited and finalized in Canada. And that's going to affect Canada too. And that's the kind of thing which he may or may not do it. You can't be sure that he will. He's just throwing it on the wall to see if it sticks. And that's what Carney has to do. He has to play the dirty game, I'm sorry to say. And I'd be very interested to follow up. And when we get back together again, we'll see, because in the period between now and then, we'll see how this plays out. We'll see what Carney does or doesn't do. We'll see how the Canadian public reacts. We'll see what Trump does, because Trump has something up his sleeve with Carney. He's not going to just force him to bend a knee. He knows that's not going to be so easy, but he'll find ways to bring him to some subservience. And I'm very concerned about that, because as you know, Ken, most people in the United States side with Canada on this. They know that Canada is our best friend, and they're outraged that Trump is doing this to Canada. It's just outrage. On the other hand, Trump doesn't care about that. And he is trying to be a winner against everyone and dominate all relationships. And there's no reason why he won't try to dominate his relationship with Carney and Canada. Your closing thoughts to leave with people.
I think that the reaction of Governor Newsom from California, he has ads in Alberta and British Columbia right now, saying California loves Canadians. We're sad you aren't coming as often, but we will treat you a lot better than U.S. policy. I mean, it's really blunt. And I think, though, that's sort of the Carney way of dealing with the United States, is having important other people influencing American authorities who in turn will go to Trump saying, Iowa is really hurting. We're choking because of the price of potash because of your dumb tariff on potash, or Michigan is going to be screaming, the auto workers are sucking air now, their employment, because the supply chains have all broken down and we need, back off of this stuff. Like, the pressure that's best is from Americans. I believe that's what the Carney approach will be. I also think that's the smartest approach. I just don't think doing what Premier Ford did, saying, well, we're going to put a big charge on electricity that's going to New England. No,
they should hang together. All the provinces should hang together. This is not a time to hang separately. Well, and Carney has got to set that up. He's got to bring everyone together. This is all of Canada versus Trump. You've hit a very good point, a very important point. Just as Trump will use the press, I guarantee he will use the press He will use his, communications people and social media and Trump social and all that to offend Carney, to make Carney look bad, to bring Carney to his knees and to hurt him politically. He'll do that. But Carney has to speak also. I don't know when this meeting is. I know it's coming very soon. But before the meeting, maybe during or after the meeting, Carney has to get in the press too. He has to match Trump. He has to say to Gavin Newsom, "You're right." And just as the people in California love the Canadians, the Canadians love the people in California. Matter of fact, they love the people all over the United States. And we really feel that the people of the United States should love us and do love us. And they should speak to their representatives and they should speak to the White House and tell them to stop this. Now, the problem is that if he does that, he exposes himself to criticism by Trump. But he's got to take some risks in this. That's my point. That's what I would close with. He's got to take some risks. It's not a matter of going down there and having a very gentlemanly discussion. That's not going to work. Anyway, we have 2 weeks to see what happens. We'll see how Carney conducts himself. We'll see how Trump conducts himself. We'll see how the Canadian people conduct themselves. And I guarantee at some point in that 2-week period, it'll be front page yet again. Anyway, thank you so much, Ken. It's been a great discussion. I really appreciate you bringing us current on this. Thank you so much to our guest, Ken Rogers, Dr. Ken Rogers, retired Canadian businessman. I'm Jay Fidell, host of View from the North. We've been discussing Canada under Mark Carney and how he's going to deal with Trump. Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha. Aloha, Ken.
Aloha from Canada. And remember that Canadians and Carney are not obnoxious like Trump.